Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to our 23rd Bridges of Belonging on February 23rd. So excited to have this time with you and to welcome our two incredible guests. So we will introduce Kluane and Aly in just a minute, but I do want to begin by acknowledging the territory I'm coming to you from today, which is the traditional territory of the Coast Salish people in Victoria and home of the Esquimalt, Songhees, and Wasanic nations, and invite you to spend a moment acknowledging the territory that you may be on today, whether traditionally or as a guest. Looking forward to this conversation today. As you know, we always begin with a bit of a quote. So today I'm going to share from The Body is Not an Apology, which is by Sonia Renee Taylor. And if you have an opportunity to watch some of Sonia's work, she's just really has such beautiful, beautiful words. So today I'm going to begin by sharing a piece that she published just in her second edition of the book, which just came out last week, and I received yesterday as a birthday present. So very excited for my new read. I have not read her whole book yet, but I look forward to it. So here we go. We arrived on this planet with the source material already present. I am in no means implying that the work you may have done up to this point has been useless. To the contrary, I applaud you, whatever labor you have undertaken that has gotten you this far. Survival is damn hard. Each of us has traversed a gauntlet of traumas, shames, and fears to be where we are today, wherever that is. Each day we wake to a plate full of social, political, and economic obstructions that siphon our energy and diminish our sense of self. Consequently, tapping into our natural intelligence often feels nearly impossible. Humans, unfortunately, make human exceptionally hard for each other. But I assure you, the work we have done or will do is not about acquiring some way of being that we currently lack. The work to crumble the barriers of injustice and shame leveled against us so that we might have access to what we have always been, because we will, if unobstructed, inevitably grow into this purpose for which we are created, to be our own version of an oak tree. I have my own name for natural intelligence. It's called radical self-love. And this is an opportunity to expand and unleash the full power of radical self-love as a tool for social change. In a time of unrest, uprisings, and a longing for what is possible beyond disconnection, radical self-love is a pathway towards personal and collective transformation. It is time we use it to change the world. So with that, I'm really excited to introduce you to two change makers and two people that are doing incredible work in the ways that they show up in the world. And so I'm going to introduce you to two people that I just really am so grateful to call colleagues and friends. First, I'll introduce you to Regional Chief Kluane Adamek. And Kluane is based in the Yukon, and she's a regional chief with the Assembly of First Nations. And Kluane and I know each other from the sport world many years ago. And so this is a really incredible opportunity to get to reconnect around this topic. So Kluane's been part of the Assembly of First Nations as the Yukon Regional Chief since January 2018. She's a proud Northerner and a citizen of Kluane First Nation. Regional Chief Adamek belongs to the Killer Whale clan and comes from a diverse background with Tlingit, Southern Chuchone, German, and Irish origins. She completed a Bachelor of Arts in Canadian Studies from Carleton in 2009 and then went to work at home in Yukon First Nations and local communities around education, economic development, and governance. She's also completed her Master's of Business Admin from Simon Fraser and has served on a number of boards and committees. And we look forward to hearing more about Kluane's journey. Our other guest today is Aly Virji, and Aly is currently the Vice President of People, Equity, and Culture at a tech startup in Toronto. He's also an adjunct college professor and university instructor. Aly's earned his designation as a Canadian Certified Inclusion Professional and teaches a variety of courses in leadership, communications, diversity, and career development. Aly has also served for many years on the Toronto Police Service and brings a diverse background of lived experiences as well. And Aly and I get to go to school together, so that's how we met in the fall and just instantly hit it off. So really excited to have this conversation with both of you. We're going to turn it over to Regional Chief Kluane to kick us off.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited. I've been excited for the last little while about the opportunity to connect and to share and to learn and to spend some time. I want to acknowledge that I am joining you from the traditional territory of the Kwanlin Dun and Ta'an Kwichen Council, so located here in beautiful Whitehorse, Yukon. The photo behind me, we had an opportunity to talk a little bit about it, but what I wasn't able to share is that this is actually Kluane Lake and Touch El Dal. Touch El Dal is otherwise known as Sheep Mountain. So for those of you who are watching, pop into your search browser and take a look. That's Kluane Kai. That's the nation I come from. As Andrea shared, I'm from the Dakhlawedi Killer Whale Clan, and my Tlingit name is Age. And my grandmother was Southern Shoshone, and she recently passed away. And my grandfather was Tlingit, originally from Natasahini, which is the Carcross traditional territory, but he grew up in and around Kluane. So I'm really, really pleased to join you all, and such an important part of the conversation when we think about belonging. And so what I think would be really helpful for us to talk about is kind of what that means for us as peoples, in this case, specifically Indigenous peoples, First Nations peoples, but also women. And also going beyond to really acknowledge and recognize how we can create more belonging in what we do. And it's interesting. I was listening to a podcast. I'm a huge Brene Brown fan, and I I know I love Brene. I was listening to Brene over the weekend, and it was an older podcast. It was from October, but it was with her and Elizabeth Bresser. So she was the author of the book Broken Open. That was one of the books that she had was talking about. But it was so interesting to think about kind of and to use the term kind of like the old ways, right? If we think about, kind of society, not from an Indigenous worldview, I want to be really clear. I think that that's where we do have an opportunity and a moment to really learn about what an Indigenous worldview means for those non-Indigenous people who may be joining. But it was really interesting to look at kind of like the old story. And so Elizabeth talked about like the old story being, about power, and power really being about, the way that power was described and the way that we kind of see power isn't necessarily about making change, as like someone like Martin Luther King would describe it. It's kind of seen to be more about like control, right, and authority. But this kind of strong power through physical strength, power through like hierarchical models, as opposed to where, and I think if COVID has taught us anything, right, it's really about working together. It's really about partnerships. And so then, she also went to compare kind of this kind of competitive nature, authoritarian nature versus like what we need more of, which is to be more interactive, and to collaborate more and to connect more and to listen more. And, our elders will often say, right, and I don't think it's just from an Indigenous worldview, but you have like 2 ears and 1 mouth. So, this kind of concept of really listening, and then also, the kind of old story where, you don't see as much of that like encouragement and praise. But this kind of new school where it really is about encouragement and praise, when people are showing up, when people are stepping up, when people are being vulnerable, right, as opposed to really looking to minimize sharing, talking, and feeling. We actually really need to do more of that. And so I really like this podcast because, especially in this time and place we're in, and this whole concept of belonging, and kind of taking back the layers, if you will, and really thinking about, as human beings, like where are we right now? And what do we really need? And thinking about, those very basic needs, and recognizing that, as human beings, we don't all have the same access. There's, a lot of different, whether earned or unearned privilege, right, that also exists. And so how do we start to have more conversations about topics just like this, belonging? How do we create that space? And I think to some it would probably sound really like fluffy. It's like, okay, yeah, but like we need to get work done. And I hear that a lot. And I'm like, okay, I get it. But like, let's take pause for a minute, right? Like, people need to feel connected. People need to feel included. People need to feel heard and know they're being heard, not just listened to. And how do we create those spaces to ensure, and it's funny because my mom's always reminding me, and I think about even the space to be able to have been invited to share perspectives today, right? Like, who is and isn't in the room when we're having conversations, and who is and isn't in the room when decisions are being made. So I think this is a really pivotal time for us as peoples, as human beings, as women and men and those who identify. I'm thinking about the future generations, and what do they then expect of us, regardless of whatever role or title you may have. But everyone has an ability to create change. And so what is it that we need to be doing to really advance that change? And so topics that are certainly of interest to me, both personally and professionally, of course, climate. You look at this photo of Kluane Lake, and the lake has dropped by about 10 feet. You can also Google that and like on your own time and check out the videos, but it's pretty wild. So in the north, we experience the direct seen and felt impacts of climate like 3 times faster than anywhere else. So this is real time. We go from temperatures that are like -30 to -40 to then like 7 degrees. Like, it's totally bizarre. Animals are confused, fish are confused, we're confused, and that's something that's incredibly important. And throughout this, not just serving as regional chief, but in terms of the work that I feel certainly connected to, but I feel is really important, is how to bring young voices, how to create space for women, and how to ensure that we're again bringing those voices together that may not always have the opportunity to be heard. So I want to take pause. I see there's some people that I know on here. It's so exciting. My mother-in-law who's online, Gail. Hey, Gail. I'm surprised but happy to see you. And Ish Van der Rassel, who is a really, really amazing ally and support for me. I appreciate he beaded me a pin, which was so cool. So I just wanted to say special shout out, and there's some first names I see there that could be also friends, but I may not know. So I'm really happy to join you, and I'm so excited to share the space with Aly. Of course, right before you jump on a panel, you're like Googling and checking out like who the other person or persons are. And so it's amazing, the work that you've done, and certainly your commitment to share knowledge and to create space for knowledge sharing is also incredibly important. So thank you again, Andrea, for the opportunity to join, and looking forward to spending some more time with you talking and engaging.
Awesome. Thanks. Such a great way to kick us off, Kluane. Thank you. Really appreciate it. And yeah, looking forward to hearing a bit more about your journey as regional chief and some of the portfolios that you're influencing to make change in our world. So Aly, over to you to tell us a little bit more about your background and story, and why all this is important to you.
I definitely appreciate that. And I think what I'll start by doing is first saying happy birthday to you, Andrea. We know it was yesterday, but officially happy birthday from all of us. And thank you for inviting me to be a guest. I think you did a great job with the intro, kind of giving people a background of what I've done and kind of what I do. But I just want to build on, the Brene Brown story, because I feel like, we're connected through Brene, so many of us, right? Like, it's just, there's so much wisdom there, and I absorb a lot of Brene's content as well. And I really think that there is like this huge opportunity, and the pandemic has just accelerated it, to look at the word belonging and the concept of belonging in a completely different way. I was definitely one of the people, the first time I heard belonging sort of getting added on to, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And I kind of rolled my eyes a little bit, and I thought like, okay, here we go. Somebody's adding some more words. Um, and, and I'm sure other words will also be added. But I think for me, my experience recently around this has been really interesting. And it's really forced me to reflect on like, what is belonging? And Brene's definitely provided a ton of guidance on that, and just kind of thinking about belonging and fitting in, and how they're not the same thing. In fact, I think she describes them as like the opposite, or opposite ends of the spectrum, and how you change yourself to fit in, but that doesn't mean that you belong. So I really appreciate this opportunity. Looking forward to engaging and exchanging information, and thank you.
Yeah, the Brené piece, my 8-year-old actually now quotes that about belonging and fitting in. So I'm creating a little Brené following with my child. But no, thank you for that, Aly. I think that's a really important piece to kind of focus on, and thinking about how we support that. I recently did a graphic from one of our presentations trying to define the different areas of diversity, inclusion, and belonging really simply, right? Because people are wrestling with all these terms that we've been kind of throwing around. And so what we defined on that slide was that diversity is who you are, inclusion is what you need to be successful, and belonging is the feeling of what all of that equates to. So I will just share that with the group in terms of a way to kind of think through some of that, because I know while many of us are kind of entrenched in these spaces each day, it's such an opportunity. So Aly, tell us a little bit about your work right now. Like, you're leading a startup organization around sort of the people and the culture. And then you also bring this really interesting background in terms of your work in the police service, which, as we know, has had a few challenges, particularly in this past year. And so how do some of those pieces show up for you in terms of how you support those around you and start to create some of those spaces? You're muted.
So I was actually gonna wear a shirt that says "You're on mute," because like this is like my trademark. So that you got the real Aly Virji today, because I was on mute. Um, Thank you for the question. What I was gonna say was that I think it's a really important question, because this is work that so many of us have been doing for such a long time, and I feel blessed to have had the opportunity to be involved in this type of work for I like to say my entire life, but specifically in a professional setting, I'd say since about 2012, maybe 2011. So all the better part of almost 10 years. And it was a blessing, because the way I describe it to people is I say I was doing this stuff before it became popular, and I think a lot of us feel that way, right? Like, we were entrenched in this work, and now all of a sudden it's getting so much more traction, which is a good thing. Like, it would have been nice if that oak tree got planted 30 years ago, but the fact that it got planted last year, it's the second best time. So I'm very grateful that I've had the experience and the opportunity to talk about these important issues, and really appreciate the policing experience that I have, because I think it's really helped me to understand people, and how there's so many things that we often take for granted in terms of where the starting place that people are coming from. We often see people in policing, for example, like after they've committed a crime, and the criminal justice system gets involved, but really understanding that person's journey and the uniqueness in that journey. And I think Kluane spoke about it a little bit around just understanding that, like, not everybody has the same privileges, right? The fact that, like, right now I have the opportunity to speak is a huge privilege, and not everybody has that. And that can't be lost on any of us. And I certainly try to remind myself of that um, in the everyday scenario in life. Like, you get into, I'll use Rogers as my example because I've been a loyal Rogers customer for many years, but I've had my hiccups with Rogers service, right? So, to be able to call and advocate on my behalf to say like, hey, like I'm not being treated fairly. I feel blessed to have had, the knowledge, skills, and abilities and experience to do that. But I need to also recognize that not everybody can do that, and not everybody can advocate for themselves. So for those of us who do have a voice, I think it's our responsibility and our duty to make sure that we advocate for those who don't. And I'll quote Brene, probably slaughter the quote, but I think the way she described this was, um, that is privilege. Privilege is the ability to say something, but then not doing anything because it's uncomfortable. And I think acknowledging that privilege and not, apologizing for it, but just recognizing that like, this is my responsibility now. I have a voice and I need to use it. So I just want to share that, and I'll kick it back to you, Andrea.
Thank you. Kluane, what about you? You also referenced power earlier along with privilege. And so, you're in a really important position now where you have an opportunity to kind of advocate and use that position in the Assembly of First Nations to kind of make change and to influence how we move forward. So tell us a little bit about that journey for you, and then we'll kind of circle back to the belonging side of things.
For sure. And I think, for me, it's really, I mean, it's interesting when we think about, our national advocacy organization, and in terms of like, its story in and of itself. We look to like the history, with respect to like the white paper and then the response. We look at the American Indian movement. We look at the what was framed as, right, the National Indian Brotherhood. And I know that eventually we'll get to the name change because legally the AFN is still referred to as the National Indian Brotherhood. But the AFN, and in the Yukon, we had the Yukon Native Brotherhood. So it's, I mean, I think it's really interesting if we kind of break down, that history in and of itself, and through the impacts of colonization, through like thousands of years of kind of the ways in which societies advanced, the roles of women in particular for us as Indigenous people was, from our worldview is very different, and like by community and nation by nation. But, I do see our national advocacy organization, and the an undeniable sphere of influence that the AFN has, because of the really important work that the AFN does. And when I think about that whole concept of power, it's really interesting because, people always will say, oh wow, like, you've got so much power there. But I'm actually like, I always remind people, I'm like, well, in this role, absolutely, there's abilities that I have to, engage with our federal colleagues directly, in a way that I may not be able to, if I weren't in this role. But to me, the power, and this can never change. The power has to stay with the rights holders. That's the power, right? And so I kind of often joke, it's like, well, I've got, there's 14 chiefs in the Yukon. So I'm like, I've got like 14 bosses, and then I've got like, over 10,000 citizens that I'm accountable to, on top of serving as a board member of our national organizations, right? So at least 2 million people. Like so I wanted to, as we talk about this kind of, what is power, and you'll have to, correct me on this quote. I'm not necessarily quoting, but, there was a Martin Luther King quote that talked about, what power really is the ability to instill like inspiration in creating change through others, right? It's not this kind of concept over time that when we see power as being through, and you're like, we go back like thousands and thousands of years, like if we look at, kind of like the Roman Empire, right? It was about like military and militia and control and taking of. is power not really about creating change and inspiration? And that, to me, I think, I'd like to see more conversations about that happen, and kind of also this falsity that exists, especially for me in my role. Again, undeniable sphere of influence through this national organization, incredible opportunities that, sometimes and I should probably do this more. Really sit and think about like all those amazing moments and the gratitude that I have to just even be able to be in the room, right? Because again, like not everyone has the opportunity to even just be in the room, to have some of these conversations. At the same time, I think it really is about people recognizing the power that they also have. And I shouldn't say, I want to correct that. Not that they also have the power that rests within themselves. And I think when I see young people, I had a meeting just yesterday about some youth projects. We're celebrating the Year of the Youth. It's kind of been extended because of the pandemic, but that's great. Um, we, we as leaders, all of us as leaders, regardless of role or title, right, have a responsibility to create space for young people to be really pushing and pressing for what it is that they see and what they need. And so as we talk about, perhaps the opportunity to influence and advocate, that through the Assembly of First Nations is quite remarkable and incredible. And I want to also, and I think this is that piece that you mentioned, Aly, about kind of how do we really describe that concept of belonging? How do we also really start to think about, okay, what is the power that exists within me as an individual, my family, community, nation, region, nation state, if you will. But what then can I do, and how can I actually contribute? And that, I think, for me in this role was always the biggest question. And any role that I've taken has been, what's the best way for me to contribute, right? Is this the best space for me to contribute what it is that either my elders, or in this case, the chiefs, feel are really important? And does that align with my values? Am I the best, caveat to advance that change? Those are some of the questions that I'm, through Brene and others, but especially our knowledge keepers, continue to remind me. It's what's the best way for you to contribute? Because everyone has experiences, skills, gifts, things that make them special, things that make us just who we are, and that is enough. And so what's the best way then to contribute? And so those are the questions that I really hope that we start to talk about more as people, as humans, so that we're able to then navigate together. Okay, how do we set up this person to be most successful? How do we set up this person to be most successful? And how do we define success, right, when we think about that concept of belonging? So those are some really, I know we're like going there right now, but I'm excited. Like, these are the kind of conversations that, I think give and expel the energy that we need to like keep pushing through whatever it is that we may be pushing towards.
So many pieces in that. I don't even know where to start.
It's all there. It's all there.
I'm going to start with, I think it's the Spider-Man quote, that with great power comes great responsibility, because that was one of the first things I heard in that piece. But the contributions and the opportunity that we need to be kind of seeking out and supporting people in to really show up as they are, to create the spaces for them to contribute in those ways, to me is just like such a poignant piece of where we're at in this point in time, in this juncture. And out of here, how do we really set up our systems and structures so that they actually support the people that need to be supported, not the few that they were originally designed by? So, Kluane, I'm going to stay on you for a second, because I would love for you to tell us a little bit about, you've played a number of roles over your career in life, and you've, kind of had all these great experiences. Tell us a little bit about sort of when belonging has shown up for you and when it hasn't, and what that's looked and felt like.
I think that's such a great question, because I think it's so easy to talk about what I find, and again, you know, each of us may have a different experience, but I think it's really easy to talk about like where you don't feel you belong as opposed to what belonging actually feels like, right? And there's Bernie's challenge. It's too bad she didn't join us today, you know? Anyway, wouldn't that be amazing? But definitely the feelings of, and I think about Kim Samuel, you might have seen some of the work she's done on like social connectedness, right? Like what does it then, from my perspective, it's those moments where you're not feeling connected, you're not feeling heard. There's the belonging in terms of connection to value, the values that that are important to you. Moments of perhaps feeling, and again, I know that there's different definitions, but I think about the concept of like being interconnected, and this example that Kim talked about, Kim Samuel, you can check her out. She's done some interesting pieces on this too, is like that feeling of like, I think she describes it as like being in like a well all by yourself at like the very bottom, and just being like, you might be physically in a space, but you're like, that's how you feel. Versus to me, what belonging feels like is to know that there's a place and space for voice, there's a place and space for safety, and that you're able to truly show up as you are and not armor up, so to speak. That to me, you know, and there's been a lot of different, you know, whether it's meetings or boards or other experiences I've had where you're like, you might be sitting in the room and you might be speaking, but no one's actually listening to what you're saying. Or you're being constantly interrupted, which is like another problem. You're like, no, like, are you hearing me though? Can you share with me what you think I just heard, or what you heard from me? Like there's all these different strategic ways to do that. But yeah, I felt that disconnect. And it is hard. It's really hard because it is figuring out how do you either pull people together, and kind of also that acceptance that sometimes people might just not want you to belong into what it is that they're doing. And so then how do you readjust and still find your path? And I think in this role, especially, you know, dealing with whether it's governments or issues, it is a constant, I think, juggle to both be vulnerable, continue to act with courage, continue to come from a place of values, but also keep moving forward even when there's moments where you feel disconnected, where you don't feel honored or respected, or where you don't feel like you belong. So I think it's those moments of like, how do you figure that out? And I mean, I would so appreciate insights from others as to how they do that, because it is really, really hard. And COVID, like this is the hardest, right? And I shout out to the parents out there who are like, you know, doing that thing and all the other things. It's hard. So yeah, I know I opened up a whole other number of topics for us to keep talking about, but there have been, and to me, that kind of social connectedness and that feeling really isolated. And the last reflection I'll share in this space is about, people often think like a community, like the community my family's from, my dad lives there, Burwash Landing, like population 90, like very, very small. He doesn't feel isolated. He feels like he belongs, right? So it's not about the number of, it's about connection too. And so, you know, if he can feel so connected where he is in a very remote rural community, and then people who are living in urban settings, and again, I'm thinking about all of you, especially in southern Canada and eastern Canada right now, who are probably feeling so very isolated, even though you're around in all the things, right? So I think that social connectedness piece and that link to belonging is also like very much there.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's such a tremendous answer. And you're right. So many layers to dive into. So I'll maybe flip it to Aly for his response around sort of belonging and not belonging and how that's showing up for you and some direct experiences, Aly.
Yeah, for sure. I appreciate that. And I think, being part of this, being a guest is really what I call some forced reflection for me. So I should probably like pay you for, the therapy sessions I would have used to kind of get to where I got with this. Um, it was really interesting for me to think about the question around belonging. And, I think Kluane hit the nail on the head with like, it's easy to think about when you didn't belong or when you felt like you didn't belong, but it's harder to kind of put your finger on, what is belonging. And I really liked, two of the examples you used. You used some amazing insight on this topic. But the two examples that really resonated with me were the well, and that feeling of loneliness. And the other thing was just that idea of your dad being socially connected, even though there's only 90 people where he lives. And I think that really is consistent with my understanding of what belonging is and the way I define it, is that it's really a feeling that's inside me. I think for a long time, I thought of belonging as something that would get externally validated. So like if somebody accepts me into a group, then I belong. But I think I'm much more on the vibe of like, if I feel like I belong, then I belong. And as I reflected on this and thought about like, when were the times I felt like I belonged? And, I think I've been very lucky to have a life where I've felt like I belong in a lot of places, whether through sports or leadership opportunities, in middle school or high school, right into university, just kind of being a part of, some very um, influential groups. And I felt a sense of belonging there. But when I really thought deeply about this, I think where the belonging meant the most to me was during times that weren't so amazing, during some of the more challenging times in my life. So about 10 years ago, like a little more than 10 years ago, my grandmother passed away. And she passed away like, late on a Thursday, basically early Friday morning. And the funeral was on the Saturday. And a whole bunch of people who I had not spoken to or seen in many years showed up for that funeral. And that was a real sense of belonging, that people took time out of their life, literally finding out, probably if 20 less than 24 hours before the funeral, and they made time to show up to support me. And so much so that like there's people I talked to like several years later, and I'd say something about like, my grandmother passed away, and like, dude, I was at the funeral. And I'm like, wow, sorry, man. Like I was in a daze. Um, but it's just that sense of duty to show up and to build that relationship and trust. And, even people that couldn't show up, just taking the time to send a note. Like it's great to get, positive messages, and birthday messages are awesome, but it's the people who take the time to send those hard messages of, I'm really sorry that, you're dealing with this. And for me, I think those have been the most memorable moments of belonging. And again, thank you, Andrea, because I would not have got there without several sessions of therapy. But I definitely have a new sense of appreciation for those things, and I'll certainly change the way that I act, to make sure that I'm helping other people also get that same feeling that I got during, one of the more challenging moments in my life.
Thank you for sharing, Aly. Appreciate the vulnerability around that. And I mean, certainly we're at such a challenging time in our lives where, to Kluane's earlier point, like belonging if looks and feels different probably right now for most people. And that social connected piece has become so crucial and so much at the forefront of sort of how we're showing up. I know for, our family, my daughter being able to be in school this year suddenly feels like such a gift, right? Where we took it for granted before, but like she loves that place. That is a place and space where she feels like she belongs, which I'm so grateful for. But I also am so conscious now about like, what are those dynamics at play that allow people to feel supported in those environments and feel like that is their space and place. So I'm going to go to values. These came up a little bit earlier in our conversation. Kluane, you've strongly referenced values in your last statement as well. And I know values are extremely important to both of you and kind of living into your values. So Aly, we'll maybe stay with you. Tell us how you feel values contribute to your belonging journey and what values you ascribe to in order to create that for others. And you're on mute.
I swear that time I hit the button, that was definitely not a user error. So, values have been really, really important to me. And I think that when I reflect on how that's connected to belonging, it really comes down to whether or not I feel like I'm in integrity with somebody. And, having that sense of understanding of who I am and what's important to me has been like super important, because it really, sometimes you just get that feeling where just like something's just not connecting with somebody, or in a meeting, like somebody says something that's like, for me, it's like that's not looking after people, where you're looking after the business and not the person. And I'm just like, no, me and you are not going to get along. And I have to check myself, because I know that I have really strong feelings, and my value around looking after people is so strong that it can sometimes be an overused strength, and I will lose sight of the business and profits and everything else that might be important in running a business. Um, but I think that's really it for me, is just that figuring out what's important and then finding people who are in alignment. And I think one of the biggest challenges for me, that I've starting to grapple with more over the last, couple of years, is being able to recognize when I'm out of alignment and accepting that, and not trying to only look at the portions of that person's personality or their behavior or their choices that are consistent, but also recognizing that somebody's on their own journey and it might not be in integrity with my journey, and just accepting that and recognizing that maybe we'll kind of separate ways, and it doesn't make my way right or my way wrong. It's just that they're different, and that's okay.
Mm. How about you, Kluane? Values, like I know that's just so integral to you as well. So tell us a little bit about your journey with that and how you see that connecting to belonging.
I loved, it was probably like 5 or 6 years ago, and I had the opportunity to work with a woman. Her name's Maureen Johnstone, but she's a Tahltan woman from the Yukon who was starting to do like coaching, and I never done coaching, and I'm like, I have a really great therapist, and that's great, but I didn't understand what coaching was. And so anyway, she's like, I need to, I also want to acknowledge that like that even in and of itself, people to actually have access to talking to someone. There's a whole bunch of new resources. What's the number? Is it like 611? I can't remember. There's a number you can call now, and you can actually like speak to someone right away. I'm going to try to Google that and share it. But through the Indian Residential School settlement program, those of us who have, are intergenerationally impacted by residential schools, there's this really amazing program that is unfortunately sunsetting, but it does offer supports for those who have been directly impacted. And so for me, my grandmother, my dad went to day school, my grandmother went to residential school. So I've really, over the last probably 6 years, I had no idea that this was something that was provided, and it is amazing and it's important. So to the coaching place, I was like, yeah, let's do the coaching thing. And so in 2015, we did this like, I got to do this process with her where we figured out what my values were. And I actually recently just kind of did it again. Well, it was 2020, but pretty close. And some of them were the same, but some of them were different. And it's really interesting. And I really liked how you shared, Aly, with us that, yeah, it is that moment where you're like working on someone or you're trying to connect with something, or something happens and it's like, ugh, it's like that icky or like that jerky kind of like, this does not feel right. This does not feel good. And a lot of the time it's because your values are just like not, just your values are not aligned. So it is like in all the places and spaces that we're in, there's always going to be that uncomfortable rub or moment. And so it is trying to figure out like the strategies to navigate that. But it's interesting that we're talking about belonging, because belonging was one of is one of my values. It's newer, for me, which is really cool. And then another one that, has come up for me that, that are newer, kindness and authenticity, right? Like, and I think this is really interesting because people are like, I talk often about how I feel, and I know like politics in and of itself has its own definition, but I also feel like we need more leaders and less politicians, especially right now. And like we look at the countries that have been so amazing in terms of their response to COVID-19, and like just this really authentic leadership. And it's not to say that you can't make mistakes. It's not to say that it's about perfection, right? But it's just like, be real. And I want to have more of those real conversations. So, in terms of values, I think that's where, and sometimes it's hard to be real, right? To say what you really want to say, you got to find the right words. Sometimes you just got to say it. And so it's kind of this balance, of always being respectful and always being kind. But something that was taught to me, both by a former leader I used to work with, and I could hear my grandma saying it too. It's like, you can't make it about people. It's not about the person, it's about the issue, right? So if something happens, it's not, oh, you did this. It's, okay, if we're going to be, standing for this particular issue, then we need to stand for that issue. That's what we need to stand for. Or if this isn't right, then we need to talk about that. It doesn't matter, who was or wasn't involved, like whatever. If this is not okay and we can agree on that, then let's be hard on that issue. And I find like it's so easy in these places and spaces of like politics for it to just be so political. And I'm like, whoa. So I find, for me, this clash, and it's so funny because people are like, but you're in an elected position. And I'm like, I totally am. And I always am trying to navigate through like that discomfort feeling because I'm like, but you just said this, like, this doesn't make sense to me. So yeah, I think that it is. And I'm trying to think, maybe that's something we can send out, Andrea. I'm trying to think in my head. I think there's like those online exercises you can do to like figure out your values. Again, I got to work with someone who was starting to coach. So she's like, I'll help you. I was like, this is great. I'm into it. But I do think that, having that time and spending that time to really articulate what they are, for you, and how they show up for you and how you show up for your values. Like, I think that is, I think, some of the most important work that we can, and gifts maybe that we can really offer to ourselves.
Yeah, oh, love that all so much, Kluane. And Aly and I were both smiling because we're actually in an executive coaching program. That's how we met. So we're on board. I'm on board.
Okay.
I was for Aly, but deeply resonate with the values and the importance of that, and sort of being rooted in your own values. And particularly when times get tough, like how do you just stand in that? And I wrote a blog last spring, kind of later in the spring, I guess, kind of as COVID was like really settling in with all of us, that I was like, our purpose and our plans have kind of gone out the window, but it's like, if you stay rooted in your values, what are the decisions you can make and how do you operate from that place? And, in building this company and bringing people together, like I'm so much about like, how are we standing in our values together? What are those places where we can agree on that? And that's what's going to guide us versus sort of whatever the flavor of the day is, or the piece that we're trying to navigate. And so, yeah, just so appreciate that. Thank you for that. And that alone is a gift, Kluane, for our listeners to like really think about that. And we can for sure look up some values resources to share out. We send an email later in the day, so we'll send some of that with that.
If I could just jump in, Andrea, if you don't mind, just want to add a couple things that came up for me. So I really like the fact that, Kluane, I really like when you talked about, your values had changed. That's something that I've really been reflecting on a lot more recently, in the executive coaching program. But as recently as this morning, actually, when I was thinking about values and today's talk, um, I think that it's important for us to, be rooted in values, but also be open to change. I think if we all, picked values in 1999, and now we just stuck to them, we wouldn't be the people we want to be. And I think it's okay for us to change. And as different things become more important for us to shift our values, as long as they're true to who we are. I don't think that you should try to be what your values are. Your values should define, your values should help explain who it is that you are. Um, and it's this morning, I actually went through an exercise where I had, reflected on my values again, and I wrote them all out. And then I said to somebody who I care deeply about, and I said, how would you describe my values? And without hesitation, I got 3 words. I'll share them with you. So the first one was, what do you value? You value status, education, and helping people. And like the word status, it stabbed me in my heart because it's not a positive thing. It's not something it's not a way that I want it to be seen. But was it absolutely true? 100% it was. It is important for me to be in leadership positions so that I can affect change. But it's also important for me because it's helpful for my ego, and that's just the reality of it. But me being able to acknowledge that is super important. And I think, I share that exercise because I think it was helpful for me. But I would definitely encourage other people to think about doing the same thing. Find somebody who you care deeply about and cares about you, who's going to have that difficult conversation, who's going to be a leader and not just, politic around it or dance around it and just tell you the good things, but somebody's going to give you some real feedback and help you reflect more on what it is that you're sharing with the world and how you're seen by others. So I just wanted to add my little piece on that. So thank you.
That's great. Kluane, do you have anything else you want to add to that?
No, there's so much, right? We could probably spend all afternoon. And Aly and I over here would just be talking values all day, but
Sure.
it is great. These are different conversations that we're having and that are important, right? Whether you're in the North or the South, or you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, I think as human beings, we need to have more of these conversations, and especially the values getting you through those hard moments, right? And it's kind of like what our elders say, you know what to do, right? And I think about that, and if I were to break it down in with a coaching lens, it's you know what to do because you know what your values are. So lead from that place, right? And leadership, again, and I talk about this all the time, it's not about a title or a role. And so I hear you, Aly, when you're oh, that was gut wrenching. You're that's not what, it is really thinking about those things. And I the last thing too, I think is really fun to do. It's called Strengths Finder, right? And it's figuring, I'm talking to the coaching peeps, they're loving this. But it's figuring out also putting an actual descriptor to the things that you're really good at. And that and calling upon those things when you need them, and maybe not so much when you don't. But one of them for me that I know I was so uncomfortable with, it was called woo. It's called woo, winning others over. And I was oh. And so I remember my mom told me when I was in daycare, I would really be connecting with adults and trying to so what are we having for snack? Trying to get in there and suggest maybe we have this. And my mom told me this, and they're Kluane is really she can get in there. But it's I'm trying to not win people over in a way that you might think from a manipulation standpoint, but I'm trying to understand what's happening, and then I'm trying to like bring people with me like on the journey, you know. And so I hear you, Aly. There's been moments where I'm like, ooh, that's not a good one. And my colleague Maureen again Johnson, she's like, no, it's not, this isn't bad. This just means that you can bring people, you know, on the train. But when do you turn that up and when do you turn that off so that it doesn't feel inauthentic? So I'm not like, hey, how are you, when I'm really trying to ask for something, you know what I mean? Like I'll just say, hey, I really need to ask something, or I need your help with something. Can we talk? Instead of the like, da, 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 oh, and this, because that just feels weird and the other person feels weird. So again, showing up with authenticity for me, but also not underplaying, you know, my strengths, for example. So I think these are some really great tools that I'd suggest for those of you who are tuning in or who are going to be taking away. Like those are some tools that, and I think you may even be able to do them like, and it's not like I think you can do them for free online, which is really cool. But it's just really helpful. It's really helpful in approach. It's really helpful in navigating. And I've found those things in this, particularly in this role. You can't go wrong with who you are, and you can't go wrong with approaching things from a place of strength. So,
Well, if that's not a like brilliant line to take us towards wrap up, I don't know what is. You can't go wrong with who you are and with strength. Love it. Thank you. We are getting towards the end of our time. I agree. We could probably talk all afternoon because I feel like we've just barely scratched the surface. So I would love for each of you to do like a 30-second kind of wrap up about like where to from here with belonging. Like what does our world need next? So Aly, I'll let you go first.
It's a really good question, and I wish I had this amazing answer and I could drop the mic at the end, but I'm not sure that I do. I think if I were to summarize what I think would be really important next steps for around belonging would be figuring out, if each of us were to take more time to figure out what belonging means to us and whether or not we feel like we belong. And I think one way for us to do that is to ask, you know, the question to ask yourself is, am I consistently or constantly distracting myself? Do I need to be distracted? Can I be alone in silence? And how do I feel about that? And I think what I'm learning is that a lot of us, and including myself, are not as comfortable in silence or without a distraction as we might like to be. And that I think is probably a really good start to figure out what is it that we need to get there. And I think once you get there, I think you're probably pretty close to having a really good sense of belonging.
Thanks. That's beautiful, Aly. And that resonates with something Kluane said earlier, and actually the theme of our newsletter this month, which was around being enough. How are you enough? How are you measuring yourself? And why are you so hard on yourself? So Kluane, over to you.
Someone once shared this with me, and I think it is incredibly important. As we talk about belonging, and so, you know, being our true selves, however that looks and feels. It is also about, to your point of you know, being with our own bestie, like us, if you will, Aly. It's who are we when no one's watching? Right? So, you know, in one place we're doing this over here, but when no one's watching, are we still doing that? Is that still who we are? And I think leading from that place is really, really important.
Oh, thank you both. Wow. This was just such a rich conversation. I knew it would be, and I'm just so, so grateful to each of you for being here and sharing and being so vulnerable with us as well. These aren't easy conversations. You have to kind of dig beyond sort of the roles and status that we sometimes get to play and actually show up authentically and just be who you are. So thank you both for doing that today and for sharing your journeys. I'm so, so grateful.
Thank you for having us. Really appreciate it.
And thank you to our guests for joining us today and tuning in. We will share this out, a link out later today on via email, and so you'll get that as well. And I just want to highlight our next conversation is coming up on March 17th, featuring Paralympian Josh Duick, who's Team Canada's chef de mission for Beijing next winter, and Bruce Kirkby, who's an acclaimed author. And I grew up in Tanaha Territory in Kimberley, and both Josh grew up there and now Bruce lives there. So there's a bit of a Kimberley connection that we're going to draw upon for this one. So I'm excited about that. So hopefully you'll all tune in for that as well. Stay safe, stay well. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Kluane and Aly.